Honourable Speaker, esteemed members of the House, and fellow Canadians. Today we confront one of the most profound questions of human freedom: the right to determine how and when we face our end. In what follows, we will argue that mature, competent adults possess the natural right to die with honour, dignity, and peace. This liberty, grounded in personal autonomy, recognises that suffering is not only physical but also existential, that failures in our healthcare system deepen human vulnerability, and that true dignity can only be preserved when individuals remain in control of their final chapter.
One of the most fundamental reasons to support the right to die is the principle of personal autonomy. Mature adults ought to have the authority to make decisions about their own lives, including the choice to end that life if they determine it is no longer meaningful or desirable. Autonomy is central to respecting individuals as self-governing agents capable of making informed choices about their existence. But autonomy cannot be understood solely in terms of medical suffering. Beyond physical pain, many individuals endure profound forms of suffering rooted in meaninglessness, isolation, or existential despair, especially when faced with persistent loss of purpose, identity, or a sense of coherence in life. In such cases, existence no longer aligns with the person's deeply held values or authentic sense of self. These conditions are often resistant to therapy, medical intervention, or external support, making them uniquely personal and frequently intractable through conventional means. When this kind of existential suffering is enduring and not the result of impulsivity or impaired judgment, it can constitute a rational and morally defensible basis for choosing death. This concern becomes even more pressing when we look at the serious gaps in the healthcare system itself. Here in Canada, many of us are not receiving adequate medical care. In my province, about 1/4 of residents lack a family physician and are left navigating a fragmented system without timely access to the treatments that could help them recover. It is neither fair nor realistic to expect individuals to depend on a healthcare system that too often fails to meet their most basic needs. My proposal, that people retain the option to die with dignity through autonomous and self-directed means, offers a way to alleviate this vulnerability. It ensures that the fundamental right to choose the conditions of one's death is not contingent on the availability of physicians, specialists, or institutional approval, but instead remains rooted in personal agency and human dignity.
To truly respect human dignity, as Simone de Beauvoir argues in her Existential Ethics, we must recognize freedom as the core of our existence. A freedom that includes the profoundest choice of all, how and when our life ends. Denying a person control over this final act reduces them to an object of circumstance rather than a subject of freedom. Ethical responsibility calls us not to impose life as mere fact, but to affirm the individual's agency in shaping the meaning and dignity of that life at every stage, including its conclusion. Life's narrative is authored by the individual, and granting autonomy over its closing chapter honours the unity of living and dying as acts of authentic freedom.
Alongside systemic shortcomings, the right to die is also about preserving the individual experience of personhood and preserving dignity and control at the end of life. Having the option to decide when and how to die enables individuals to maintain a sense of agency and self-respect, rather than feeling powerless or subjected to circumstances beyond their control. Of course, preserving dignity requires a safeguard. Such decisions need to be competent and rational. It is essential to emphasize mental competence and rationality in such decisions. When a person's wish to die is the product of careful reflection, rather than impulsivity or conditions impairing their decision-making capacity. Their choice deserves respect as a considered and rational determination. Yet even when individuals reach such decisions through rational reflection, the absence of lawful options can drive them into dangerous circumstances. When individuals are denied lawful, informed options for ending their lives, some may turn to risky, unsafe, or traumatic methods out of desperation. This not only increases the chance of needless harm, but also compounds emotional suffering and stigma for those involved. By recognizing the right to die and supporting access to clear, non-medical guidance, society can reduce the likelihood of such outcomes while respecting individual autonomy. Providing safe and reliable tools outside of medical intervention honors both personal freedom and fundamental harm reduction principles.
As scholars in feminist bioethics like Susan Dodds and Wendy Rogers have argued, genuine autonomy in end-of-life choices must be understood within the web of social relationships and structural conditions. In discussions of the right to die, it is essential to acknowledge the central role of vulnerability as an inherent and shared human condition, particularly for those facing the end of life. Feminist ethicists emphasize that vulnerability is not the opposite of autonomy, but rather a dimension that deeply informs it. This relational view recognizes that individuals make choices within social relationships and structural conditions that can either support or undermine their capacity to decide. Structural injustices, such as inadequate healthcare access, social marginalization, or economic precarity, exacerbate vulnerability and constrain genuine autonomous agency. Ethical responsibility, therefore, involves not only respecting individual choice, but also addressing the systemic harms and inequalities shaping the context in which those choices are made. Fostering dignity at life's end requires an approach integrating respect for personal autonomy with a commitment to social justice and care.
Seen from a broader perspective, recognizing the right to die is consistent with how we already treat other healthcare and end-of-life choices. Just as individuals can refuse life-sustaining treatment or establish advance directives, it seems consistent to recognize that they should be able to determine the timing and manner of their death as an extension of bodily autonomy. At the same time, failing to extend this right creates injustice for certain groups, as in the unequal burdens placed on older or more vulnerable adults. Denying the right to die sometimes feels like society is forcing certain groups to endure suffering that others are spared, which risks reinforcing ageism, ableism, and other inequalities. Ultimately, this is not just a matter of law or medicine, it is a human rights issue. Respecting this liberty aligns with broader human rights principles, especially around privacy, bodily integrity, and freedom of belief. As long as the decision doesn't harm others, the state has no role in denying an individual's personal choice regarding the end of their life. To defend the right to die with honor, dignity, and peace is to affirm the deepest respect for human autonomy and the intrinsic worth of personal choice. In a world where suffering can take forms beyond the reach of medicine, and where healthcare systems often fail to provide timely or effective relief, the refusal to recognize this right risks compounding despair with injustice. Mature, competent adults should not be forced to remain dependent on inadequate institutions, or to endure lives stripped of coherence, meaning, or self-determination. Recognizing the right to choose death when life no longer aligns with their values is not merely an act of compassion, but an acknowledgement of the freedom and dignity that define us as human beings. Ultimately, to uphold the right to die is to affirm that every mature, competent adult deserves the freedom to leave this world with the same honor, dignity, and peace that they sought to live by.
To defend the right to die is to affirm the deepest respect for human autonomy and the dignity of personal choice. Freedom is not complete unless it includes the choice of how and when we face our end. The discussion now turns to the ways in which this right might be exercised responsibly in practice, beginning with a consideration of methods that allow individuals to approach the end of life with autonomy, dignity, and peace.